Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 3, Halacha 1, Part 2 of the Shir, and the article on 26b2. So, in Part 1 of the Shir, we're dealing with the idea that what happens if you separate out Truma and you didn't know it was spoiled, and now it turns out that the Truma portion that you separated is spoiled. Well, they're going to make you separate out an additional Truma portion, and the idea is that you're not sure if the Truma you separated when you were separating it out the first time was a valid Truma separation or not, because we know already, it's already established in Chapter 2 that you can't separate out Truma from something that you know is spoiled, right? It's just already invalid. It always has to come from the best, always has to come from superior produce. But in the case that we have in Chapter 3, we're dealing with suffix, right? Nobody planned this. Nobody intentionally did this. It just happened that you say, oh, well, it turns out this Truma portion here is spoiled. What do I do with it? Did this spoil after I separated it or before? And you don't know. And there's no way to know. Only heaven knows. So the rabbis are saying that it's a suffix. It might actually still be tevel because it wasn't valid when you separated it out. And now you have to go separate it out again. And so we're going to get into another case about where, poison. What happens if it's actually going to not be spoiled, but is actually going to be ruined? And the question is, when did this get ruined? And then another thing that we're going to cover today is something that I think is interesting. What about wine that might or might not have spoiled and turned to vinegar or turned sour? So it's actually going to come up a few times in the Shas, and this is actually going to be the root from where this source is on Rebbe's ruling that about wine and vinegar. So the Gemara starts off and it says that if someone, this is a Baraisa, this is going to be in the Tosefta 4:6, and if somebody separated a barrel of wine as truma and later they found it was uncovered, or if somebody separated a watermelon as truma and later it was found to be punctured, then the portion he separated is treated as valid truma, but he also has to separate truma again to permit the remaining produce. So the rabbis prohibited the consumption of wine, water, milk that was left uncovered without supervision for a certain amount of time because they were worried that a poisonous snake either came and drank it or just injected the poison into it. And also they were talking about moist fruits like watermelons, like what happens if there's a puncture mark in it. And today, when snakes are not prevalent in settled areas, these prohibitions don't apply. But this did happen, a long time ago. And in living in Israel, there are snakes here. So the Brisa here is dealing with a situation where the barrel of wine that had been separated as truma was found to be uncovered, but we don't know whether it was uncovered before the truma designation, and this left it open to where a snake could have come and drank from it. That makes it poison, and then you can't give poison to the cone. Or you had watermelon that was separated, and then you see the puncture marks of maybe snake bites. And so it's unknown whether this puncture occurred before the designation or after. And in either case, there's a possibility that the designated portion is unfit for consumption when it was designated as truma. And then the truma wouldn't be effective. So the question is, what do you do now? So the Gemara is going to talk about this application of law. And Rabbi Yudan Bar Pazi and Rabbi Shimon say in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that the rabbis did not say that a punctured watermelon is treated as questionable truma, except in a case after being designated as truma, it was found to be punctured, and they're unsure whether it had already been punctured at the time when you separated it out as truma. So the Gemara says this implies that in a case where one initially designated a punctured watermelon as truma, his truma is not valid truma at all. We already covered this. This is not new. In other words, if at the time that you were making
the designation, you saw there were puncture marks and you're designating this watermelon as truma, well, this designation is completely invalid. It's completely void. We covered this in chapter 2, right? You always have to be taken from superior produce. So we know that that's going to be the case. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's assertion about this. So Rabbi Yaakov of the South stated before Rabbi Yossi that it is not reasonable to say that the designation of a punctured watermelon as truma is definitely invalid. In other words, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying that it might be a case where a snake bit it, so it's not going to be valid. But Rabbi Yossi is basically, or Rabbi Yaakov of the South, in front of Rabbi Yossi, is saying, well, maybe that's not the case. And he's saying that, it's not reasonable to say that this is invalid, except in the case where they actually saw the poisonous snake puncturing the melon. And otherwise, they're saying that it should just be in the status of questionable truma, since there's a doubt as to whether it was bitten by a snake or maybe it got punctured in a different way. So the Vilna Goan is going to be saying that, how can Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi state without qualification that whenever a punctured watermelon is designated truma, that the designation is invalid? And that's kind of the question, right? Like, nobody actually saw this, and maybe it fell on some rocks. So Rabbi Yossi dismisses this assertion, and he said to Rabbi Yaakov, he says, but in a case where a snake was observed puncturing the watermelon, does one know whether the snake actually injected the venom into it at that time? Obviously not. So already that, the rabbis are banning the consumption of punctured produce because the possible presence of venom is there. And the ban itself renders the food inedible, and that's going to make it unfit to serve as truma. So by the same token, any punctured melon, even if the source is going to be unknown, cannot be validly designated as truma, since its consumption is ultimately forbidden because of a rabbinic ban against the consumption of punctured produce. So there's a fence here, right? I mean, the fence that they're putting up not only is a thing of safety and protection, but is really getting back to this deeper idea that, well, this is really just ruined produce. And so, yes, they're putting on a ban for punctured produce, but the idea is that, this is a deraita thing. You always have to separate from the superior produce. And so, maybe if you're separating from something that's not valid as food at all, that, it's not deraita a valid separation at all. So the rabbis are talking about this punctured produce, and they're putting a ban on it. But again, part of why this is coming about is because there is an uncertainty about whether this is food at all. Again, if you saw the snake doing this, well, everybody agrees that you can't separate truma out of it. There's no maloket about that. But what there is a question about is where nobody saw it, and now you have a question about whether this is spoiled or ruined or poisonous produce, and was this designation a valid designation or not? And so this discussion about the forbidden produce not being deemed as food, that's going to be what the idea is. So the Gemara is going to challenge this notion about where forbidden produce is going to retain its status of food and maybe be capable of being designated as truma. And the Gemara says that the scholars asked before Rabbi Yossi, what is the difference between this preceding case of the punctured watermelon and that was designated as truma, and where the designation is completely invalid, and the case of tamei produce designated as truma for tahor produce, where under certain circumstances the designation is valid after the fact. So we learned in chapter 2 that you can't designate tamei produce on behalf of tahor produce because truma that's tamei is forbidden for consumption. But if somebody inadvertently designated tamei produce as truma for tahor produce, that designation is going to be valid after the fact. That, by the way, is in the Mishnah in chapter 2:1. So this is indicating that produce that is forbidden for consumption is still legally regarded as food, and that would technically qualify to serve as truma. So the Gemara is asking like this, that what's the difference about a punctured watermelon that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi held to be completely unfit to serve as truma? This is what what Rabbi Kanievsky is asking in his Derech Emunah about this, and he's saying, and also a case where it was designated inadvertently. What's going to be the difference? And so Rabbi Yossi is going to respond, and he says to them that tamei produce is inherently unimpaired. And the Gemara continues and says that its designation as truma is what caused it to be unfit for consumption as food. And in other words, if that portion that was tamei wasn't tithed, well, and it was tithed in a different set of circumstances where this tamei food would be chulin, it's still food, right? You could still eat it. The fact that you designate it as truma, that's what makes it a problem. And the Gemara is saying, but here, however, in the case of a punctured watermelon, where a universal decree prohibits the consumption, it's regarded as just like earth. In other words, it's completely incapable to serve as truma. So the commentary by Rabbi Kanievsky in Derech Emunah about this is like this, that Rabbi Yossi is explaining that there's a basic difference between the prohibition against eating truma that's tamei and the prohibition against eating punctured produce. In the former case, the prohibition is not seen as removing the produce's status as food, because if the produce were chulin, the consumption would in fact be permissible despite the truma. Rather, the prohibition is viewed as an external constraint that is the result of the produce having been designated as truma. In the latter case, the punctured watermelon is not classified as food at all. And considering that the ban on eating punctured produce is equally applicable to both chulin and truma. So, the watermelon, that's not considered food at all. It's just earth. In other words, it's poisonous for everybody. And so, you can't say that it's food. So one of the subtleties here is, well, what is going to be considered food? What's classified as food? And, tamei produce, okay, you can't make truma out of it for other reasons, right? Because it's superior produce, things like that. But it still counts as food. But the other thing is not going to be food at all. The Mishnah talks about the next part, where it's talking about the separation of a barrel of wine as truma that somebody found to be vinegar, and now you don't know whether he designated this truma and this is now vinegar, and it was separated as vinegar, or it was separated as wine and then turned to vinegar. And so if he separated it and it was already vinegar before he separated it, now it's not valid truma. But in any case, you have to take out two sets of trumas. Now, we see from here that it seems like wine and vinegar are viewed as two different species. And we were talking about this with pickling olives in chapter 2, that you can separate pickling olives on behalf of oil olives, but not vice versa, because they're deemed to be the same species. And so the question is, what about wine and vinegar? And is this going to be like two different species? Rebbe is going to maintain that these are actually two different kinds of produce, and that you can't designate truma from one on behalf of the other. The Mishnah indicates that. And Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, disagrees. He says that vinegar is just soured wine. It's not a different species. And therefore, the designation of vinegar as truma for wine is effective after the fact. And so the Gemara now is going to talk about the actual halacha, and it's going to talk about different versions of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion about this. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha follows the words of Rebbe. In other words, that wine and vinegar are considered two different species, and you can't designate truma for each other. And the Gemara says, but Rabbi Chia says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that our Mishnah is reflective of the opinion of Rebbe, and the halacha, though, follows the dissenting opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi. So, according to Rabbi Chia, if vinegar is found to have been separated as truma for wine after the fact, then the designation is valid after the fact. And however, it is certainly forbidden to initially designate vinegar as truma for wine, since vinegar is inferior to wine. So the question is, the Gemara, what's going on? So the Gemara is going to object to both of these versions that appear to have some inconsistencies. And Rabbi Bar Cohen asks before Rabbi Yosei Bar Zavda. So this is a different Rabbi Yosei than we were dealing with. And so the question is, did Rabbi Hia not say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan himself that in a dispute between Rebbe and his colleague, the halacha follows Rebbe? And Rabbi Yonah furthermore stated that the rule applies even on a dispute between Rebbe and Rabbi Lazar, son of Rabbi Shimon. Although the latter was recognized as a better sage of that era, the halacha still follows Rebbe. So the question is, then, according to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Aha, it shouldn't have been necessary for Rabbi Yochanan to state that the halacha follows Rebbe in the case of our Mishnah, since Rabbi Yochanan already holds that Rebbe's view always prevails over this disputant, Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosei. So according to Rabbi Hia, though, that would seem to be contradictory, because Rabbi Yochanan, to rule in accordance with Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosei, when Rabbi Yochanan himself holds that the law always follows Rebbe's view. So, Rabbi, the question is, how do you reconcile this? So Rabbi Yosei Bar Zavda defends his rulings, and he says to Rabbi Bar Cohen, Rabbi Bar Cohen, even though Rabbi Yochanan generally maintains that the halacha follows Rebbe rather than this disputant, in this case, there are grounds to say the halacha does not go with Rebbe, because since Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosei, taught his ruling in the name of his father, Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta, and by the way, in a dispute between Rabbi Yosei, who was in the Talmud, the Rabbi Yosei that we talk about is Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta, the halacha does go by Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta. So Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, he's saying, my father said. He's not saying that he said. And so this is a little bit different, because now in a dispute between Rebbe and Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta, halacha goes by Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta. It doesn't go by Rebbe. So in a dispute between Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, it does go by Rebbe. But the nuance here is Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, is not saying that he's saying it. He's saying his father said it. That's a little bit different. So since the Gemara says Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosei, is teaching this ruling in the name of his father, and the Amarah Rabbi Yosei is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that in a dispute between Rabbi Yosei the Tana, Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta, and his colleagues, the halacha follows Rabbi Yosei over his colleagues, it would seem that in this case the halacha should follow the view of Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta, was quoted by his son, Rabbi Yishmael, rather than the view of Rebbe. So the Gemara says, in order that you should not think that this is the case, and that we're going to rule in the case of Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta here as well, the Gemara says this is why it was necessary for Rabbi Yochanan to state that according to the version of Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha, that the halacha follows the case of Rebbe, the halacha of Rebbe. So the idea is that there's, when you look at this contradiction, why is Rabbi Yochanan saying this? And the reason Rabbi Yochanan is saying this is because this is a nuance, that the halacha normally does not follow Rebbe over Rabbi Yosei. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, no, in this case, it actually does follow Rebbe over the case of Rabbi Yosei Bar Halafta. That's what he's saying. So this is how we reconcile it. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that in a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. So this is going to go over guidelines about malokets between other Tanaim. And so in a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. And given these guidelines, it goes without saying, in a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halacha goes by Rabbi Yehuda. There's a related statement, Rabbi Ba and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. In a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. In a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. And it goes without saying, in a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, and the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yonatan's statement can't be directly inferred from what we just taught. So there must be another rule here, because otherwise, how do explain what's going on? And so the Gemara says, and from the latter ruling of Rabbi Yonatan, it goes without saying that Rabbi Yehuda, together with Rabbi Meir, prevail over Rabbi Shimon, and you can infer that in a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, halacha is going to go by Rabbi Yehuda. So that's why we see when Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir oppose Rabbi Shimon, their view is the one that's accepted. So the Mishnah goes on with the next case. So what's interesting here is, okay, we know that, this is, generally how things are going when this one rules or that one rules who we go by. But, there's some cases also where the halacha is going to follow Rabbi Meir. And particularly on things of rabbinic origin, we're going to look at Rabbi Meir. So this is a general guideline, but generally it's not going to go by Rabbi Meir. But in things dealing with specific parts of rabbinic things, Rabbi Meir does get some extra weight. So again, to sum up, the halacha is going to go by Rebbe on this, that wine and vinegar are two different species. And this is going to be surprising, but it's going to effectively override Rabbi Yosef Bar Halafta's ruling, because it's a dispute between Rabbi Yossi and Rebbe. But again, that's why Rabbi Yochanan is pointing this out. Now, the Mishnah was talking about if there's a doubt as to when the barrel, got separated as truma and it became vinegar, and that's going to be treated as valid truma. But then you have to separate out truma again to permit the remaining wine. And the Gemara is going to ask how these two questionable trumas are going to be dealt with. And the Gemara says, how does one proceed in this situation? Does he give both trumas to a kohen? It says he gives both trumas to a kohen, and the kohen pays him the value of one of them. In other words, one of them definitely is truma and is owed to a kohen, and one of them definitely is not truma and is not owed to a kohen. So you have to give both of them, but it's really a taking by the tribe of the Kohanim. So the tribe of the Kohanim have to pay you for one of them because it's not really theirs. It's kind of theirs, but not really. So the Gemara is going to say, which one's value does he pay him? The value of the larger truma or the value of the smaller truma? In other words, one of them is going to be spoiled and one of them is going to be real. Does he pay on the value of the real one or the spoiled one? And the Gemara says the answer can be inferred from a Mishnah, which we learned, where it says, if both trumas fell into one place in the same container of hulin, they render the hulin a forbidden meduma mixture, and according to the size of the smaller of the two portions. In other words, the basis of this leniency is a fact, because you have questionable truma. This is going to be where, the Gemara says, it tells us that when the person, in the case of the Mishnah, gives both of the questionable truma portions to the kohen pays him the value of the larger truma. In other words, that this watermelon, this might have, not been spoiled when he separated. It might have been the valid truma. And so you can't just say, well, I'm going to give you the price of a spoiled watermelon, because that actually might be the real truma. So you have to look at both of them and say, okay, what's the value of the wine, not the vinegar? What's the value of the good watermelon, not the spoiled watermelon? And you have to pay him on that. But you have to separate out two trumas. You have to give both of them to the kohen. But because, again, this is a thing of Suffolk, and none of this was done on purpose, you're giving him extra produce. You're giving him one that was, real and one that's not, and you just don't know which one. And so he has to pay you for one of them because that might be the one. And whenever we're going to extract property from somebody, it's not going to be a kanas. In other words, if we just came along to the guy who's separating out watermelons and said, "Oh well, you have to give it away for free," well, you've effectively created a penalty on this guy who was trying to do the right thing. And again, we just end up with a suffix where we don't know what it is. Only heaven knows. But we're not going to try to impose a penalty on this guy, and you're effectively taking away this guy's property. So the tribe of Kohanim have to compensate him for it, and they're going to have to compensate him because again, it's this one could be the real one, and they have to pay him at the higher value of the two. Have a great day.